Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And let me start by both congratulating those who made their maiden speech today, excellent as they were, and thanking all those for the few kind words that have been sent my direction. I dare say there's few enough such opportunities for me to hear kind words that I will bask in the reflected glory for at least 5 minutes. The Scottish Government has as its central purpose, of course, supporting sustainable economic growth. We have a strong mandate to pursue that over 5 years. And I think in the context of today's debate, we'd like to say that we wish to see rural areas empowered to support their communities and to contribute to a better Scotland. And I think that would capture the sense of the debate that we've had today. We will continue to work with Parliament, listening to ideas from wherever they come, and seeking to build consensus for all that we do. And I think the early meetings that both the Cabinet Secretary and I have had with opposite numbers and other political parties speak to the reality of what we're doing. Mike Mackenzie, in a particularly powerful contribution, invited us all round to his place for a wee refreshment. We'll be round at the weekend, Mike, don't you worry. And of course he made reference in his short speech to the economic powerhouse that rural areas can be. So I think that captured it very importantly indeed. We spent a fair bit of time talking about the Climate Change Act, and that was par excellence an example of this Parliament working together to common purpose to deliver something that was truly world-leading. We will listen to all the voices in this Parliament, as we did as we worked through the 457 amendments, in some cases amendments to amendments, on the Climate Change Act in the Parliament. The legacy report that the previous Rural Affairs and Environment Committee left to the new committee made a very important point. It said in paragraph 52 that we should avoid focusing too narrowly on the 3 Fs of farming, food and fishing. They are all very important, of course, but at the absolute core of it is what is life in rural setting like and what contributes to enhancing that. It isn't simply the food, the farming and the fishing. It is a much wider agenda altogether. I will, I'm afraid, be unable in the available time to deal with every point that has come up in debate. Clearly in committee we will return to many of the points that have been raised, but I'll try and deal with some of them. Sarah Boyack, for example, talked about public food procurement. That's worth about 130 million in the public sector. We've supported SMEs in particular to make it easier for them to bid for contracts. We agree absolutely that local businesses should work with the local public sector. That's very important indeed that happens. And in particular, through the Climate Challenge Fund, we provided 2.5 million to 39 organisations to support local food and grow your own projects. And indeed, I visited one at Letham in Fife and received a basket of the most wonderful vegetables that my wife really almost wanted me to drive back to the south of Scotland and bring some more home. So I declare an interest in good quality local food and its consumption, not just personally, but across the board. We certainly want to connect rural Scotland to everywhere. One of the things 2,000 years ago that made the Roman Empire more successful than the Greek one was they had good communications. In fact, they could send messages from Londinium to Roma in 6 hours by a system of hilltop signalling. And that underpinned 400 years of success in the Romans. Today, high-speed broadband will be equally important in looking at the success of Scottish rural businesses. Sarah Boyack made some reference to flooding. We've spent some 6 times on flooding interventions what the previous administration said, so I think our record certainly is worth looking at. And she made reference to allotments. I'm delighted that I was able, in my previous ministerial role, to visit at least 2 allotments that we had supported at Huntly and in Crieff. Electric vehicles too. We've successfully been part of a Scottish consortium to get 30 million for the Plugged in Places initiative sponsored by the UK government. So a great deal is happening indeed. Alec Ferguson, may I welcome him back in committee this morning. I nearly referred to him as presiding officer, so familiar a face has he been in that position of authority. We'll now treat him as an equal. But when he speaks on farming, we will listen very carefully to what he has to say. And I think there is considerable sympathy for the issue of form filling being a matter where we should continue to revise and improve. It's very important that that happens. As he heard in committee this morning, it is unlikely that the long-run picture on the area that is afforested is changing much at the moment. We wish to raise it, of course. We see year-on-year fluctuations because some years are more intensive for harvesting than planting, others are the other way round. It's worth just making on broadband, while I remember that, of course, it's our target to have it all over Scotland by 2020. David Torrance, in his maiden speech, talked on local food, and with great pleasure I visited the food train in Dumfries in my previous role. That was very important indeed. And Helen Eadie touched on the supergrid and the smart grid technologies. These are very important, of course, particularly the smart grid, and I was talking at Environment Council yesterday to several other environment ministers across Europe about work that is happening on smart grid. We need standards, because one of the things the smart grid can deliver for us, of course, is right down to individual consumer devices, the ability to protect, for example, heart-lung machines or dialysis machines installed in domestic houses, where if there is a power shortage, you switch off the deep freeze for a few hours, but you certainly don't switch off dialysis. So there is a lot of work going on, and we are pleased that the European Union made their first visit on the subsea grid to Scotland, recognising the importance of Scotland in the provision of renewable energy. Mark MacDonald focused on services in rural areas and talked about the Udney community wind turbines. I think it is very important that communities who wish to put up things like wind turbines, and indeed anyone who does engage with the communities that will be affected by the presence, because it's important to do that, gets consent and momentum in favour, and does not take consent for granted. There have been, I'm afraid, one or two examples where that's not been done. Food and drink, absolutely vital, fair deal for producers. He talked about exports. And Deans of Huntly. If I was looking at my constituency, I would, of course, prefer to talk about Brewdog, who now have a very successful export industry. The report on proposals and policies has been touched on by many members. We will report on progress in implementing that in the not-too-distant future. There was a few comments on housing. House sales, just to highlight the 2009 median price. Remote and rural, median 160,000, accessible rural 173, but the rest of Scotland 128. And that just shows the attractiveness of rural areas for housing. People want to move there. Presiding officer, drawing my remarks to a conclusion, I have barely scratched the surface of what was covered in this debate. But rural affairs and environment is, of course, a wide-ranging government portfolio, and the contributions from right across the chamber, each and every one of which was worth listening to, reflect that. So let me just quickly deal with three issues. We want to support communities who want to control their future.
Minister, you do need to wind up.
And we'll promote food and drink, and we'll drive down emissions. That's how we'll take Scotland forward and leaving a greener Scotland that we have borrowed from our children and grandchildren. Presiding officer.